Good afternoon, or good morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2014-15 Bennon Institute on Ignatian Leadership. This is a very special symposium. It's a Saturday morning symposium on leadership, and to get us kicked off, I would like to introduce the president of the university, Father Michael Lang.
Good morning. Welcome. Very glad to see so many of you up. I thought, who's going to be up early on a Saturday morning? So I'm very happy to see a whole room full of people here. But it's no great surprise because we have a great speaker today and a wonderful panel. I want to say a few words about the topic today, Ignatian leadership. And Ignatian leadership has some real practical roots, and I want to talk just a bit about that. First of all, I'm going to talk about it in three different ways, an application in three different ways. First of all, there's a spiritual rootedness that goes with Ignatian leadership. And secondly, there's an educational component from which it comes. And then thirdly, there's a practical application. So Ignatian leadership then touches on those three areas, the spiritual, the educational, and the practical. It's really helpful for us to remember that St. Ignatius Loyola was a person of the Renaissance period. And in the course of his life and the transformations he went through, you would call him a non-traditional student. Okay, he went back to school in his late 30s and then continued into his early 40s. So he had a whole long journey of life, and the spiritual transformation that took place along the way came out of his day-to-day experiences. You might say a midlife crisis early on, change of occupations. And he goes then from being a soldier of fortune then over to being a pilgrim, eventually to being a priest. So in the spiritual roots, he's really concerned through his own experience of how do you develop your personal potential, how do you find your way in life, and how do you make good decisions that actualize your potential and then move you forward towards a clearer vision of who you are and what you should be doing in life. And so his spiritual exercises, which he's kind of a series of reflections that he wrote, is a guide to people finding their way on the interior life. We would call that the spiritual dimension. But he came at it out of a Catholic or a Spanish Catholic background during the Renaissance. And so he's looking deeply into where has he sinned, and we would say where has he gone wrong? Where has he wasted his time and his talent? Where has he wasted his potential? And he begins drawing distinctions between that which is drawing him to greater peace and greater interior freedom and that which holds him back. And so this process of discernment, it goes all the way through his spiritual exercises, and it's what motivates him to continue looking at life, looking at his experiences. So how does one discern what is best for me and what is best for me in the world? So ongoing. So he takes that. So there's an underlying spiritual motivation, a search. He was a true searcher. He tried many different things. And in his spiritual exercises, there's recommendations. Don't do this, don't do that. It's not going to help. Because he tried them all out. It didn't work. He tried going around for a part of his life. He was just going to be totally oblivious to earthly realities, so he didn't wash his hair, he didn't trim his nails, and you can imagine what he looked like after a while. He says, well, don't go to those extremes. It doesn't help. Don't go to those extremes. So he starts talking about how you make these kinds of decisions in one's life coming out of one's spirituality. The second point then, since he was a child of the Renaissance period, he goes back to school. So the educational developments that he goes through also then comes later into the Jesuit order when that order gets started. And the time in the Renaissance, the emphasis was on what they call eloquentia perfecta. Eloquentia perfecta. How to speak eloquently. How to articulate one's thoughts and ideas. How to speak with logic. And the whole idea behind this is how can you then articulate what you are thinking and then apply it in ways to persuade others to follow the right path. So this educational component, that it's his experience. He goes to the University of Paris along the way. and he meets up. That's where he meets the first Jesuits that formed the order, the first men that formed the order. And they're grounded in this Renaissance approach, then, of developing one's personal potential, educating oneself, and then being able to articulate that in ways for the benefit of yourself and the benefit of society. So it's a very important step along the way. And then the Renaissance humanism, this great love of the arts and the sciences, exposed them then to all the great learning of the world at that time. That there was nothing they didn't look at. They loved physics, they loved geography, they loved the classics, they loved art, they loved literature. So all of these components made up the educational system of the time at the University of Paris. And so later, when the Jesuits formed the order and then eventually found schools, one of the early presidents of the very first college in Rome that the Jesuits had, now known as the Gregorian University, but the president then, Diego de Ledesma, talked about the goal of Jesuit education was another great Latin phrase, which I really love, maxime humanissime. Maxime humanissime, that you may become the fullest expression of the human experience. Each of their students should develop this fullest expression of their potential to become fully human. So that meant well-educated, spiritually developed, and then taking this for the good of society. Not just for the good of the individual, but for the good of society. And so that leads us into the practical application that Ignatius and the Jesuits wanted, that what we receive in our schooling to prepare us to be leaders to make a difference in society. To be leaders, to make a difference in society. And so the whole Jesuit framework of education, development of the individual, rooted in spirituality, and then looking at society to see how can we advance the good for all, the common good. How can we make society better? And that's why it's so important that we have somebody like Zoe Lofgren coming today. Zoe, who has been a graduate of our law school, Zoe, who has taken her talents and her education and applied that then for the development of society, the good of society, okay, by serving in Congress, and prior to that, in terms of local government. She's taken her talents and used that then for the good of others to improve then society. So she's a great one then to lead off today, a great one then to show us how one applies that. And then later in the day, Sharon Kugler will be speaking about how one does it another fashion, which is then in the world of chaplaincy and accompanying others in their spiritual journeys, particularly at a university setting. So with these thoughts in mind, I want to welcome our first speaker, Zoe Lofgren, who will be coming up here to then talk on how she sees Ignatian leadership. So let us welcome Zoe. Thank you.
Although she really does need not much introduction, let me just say a few words about Zoe Lofgren. An alumna of the law school, she's going to be speaking about leadership and justice. She serves in the U.S. Representative California for the 19th Congressional District. Born in San Mateo, attended public schools in Palo Alto, received her BA in political science from Stanford University, and then her JD cum laude from Santa Clara School of Law. Earlier in her career, she served as staff assistant to her predecessor, Congressman Don Edwards, with whom she worked on the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Very interesting time of history. She practiced immigration law, taught immigration law here, and was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1994 as the only freshman Democrat from west of the Rocky Mountains. She currently serves on a committee on Homeland Security and the Subcommittee on Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terrorism Risk Assessment, the Subcommittee on Economic Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Cybersecurity, and the Subcommittee on Management, Integration, and Oversight. She also serves on the committee on the Judiciary in the Subcommittee on Courts, Internet, Intellectual Property, Subcommittee on Immigration and Claims, and Subcommittee on Immigration, Border Security, and Claims. She serves as chair of the 38-member California Democratic Congressional Delegation, married to John Marshall Collins, and together they have 2 children, Sheila and John Collins. After Zoe's comments, she's going to be joined in conversation by Professor Cynthia Mertens of the Law School and Professor Elsa Chen of the Political Science Department. Please welcome Zoe Lofgren.
Well, first, let me thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's really quite wonderful to be back on campus. I spent many happy years here, and I think I owe Santa Clara a lot. I was mentioning to Cynthia that when you're invited to give a few remarks, it causes you to reflect on some of the questions that you have been asked, and I'm glad for that. It has caused me to think back to when I first entered the law school and my days here. Just a quick bio on me. You know, I grew up in this county. Sometimes I tell people I grew up in Palo Alto, and they assume that we must have been quite affluent, but it was a different Palo Alto then. My dad was a truck driver. My mom was a cook in a school cafeteria, and I got a scholarship which allowed me to go to Stanford, which obviously changed the trajectory of my life in a significant way. After I graduated from Stanford, I went to Washington without a job, just thinking I could somehow change the world, and ended up working for Congressman Don Edwards. And it was while on his staff that I realized, as I was working on writing bills, that I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was dangerous. And Alan Parker, a graduate of the law school and a member of the Board of Visitors, decided with me that I should go to law school, and he decided I should go to Santa Clara Law School. And so he stood over my shoulder while I filled out the application, and then the late Mary Emery, then the Dean of Admission, called me the next day. I mean, I think it was before the application had probably arrived in retrospect, to give me the good news that I had been admitted. And that there would be a small scholarship involved. And so I never applied to another law school. And I think actually it was fate, and I'm actually very grateful that I ended up at Santa Clara. You know, Santa Clara is a Jesuit law school, but I'm not a Catholic. And the law school at the time, and I think currently, is not overtly religious. I mean, it is a secular institution. When I was there, there were no, Father Goda was the only Jesuit on the faculty. I'm not sure now that Paul's retired that there are any Jesuits left on the faculty. And that's very similar to the 13 Jesuit law schools in the United States. There's really no Catholic law that is taught. They are secular. Most of the students are not Catholic. But there are some themes. I think one of the themes of this law school and the other Jesuit institutions is to be thorough. There are very high legal standards for excellence. And I will say that that is actually a key bedrock principle if you're going to be successful in any endeavor, and especially in the public sector. You know, in my work on immigration as well as other issues, one of the things I've learned is that I have to know the subject matter cold. I mean, I have to know the statutes. I have to read the cases. I have to read the footnotes in the cases. I have to read the cases that are mentioned in the footnotes, and to be prepared, because many of these issues are quite contentious. And if you are not armed with the facts and the law, you will never be successful in moving the cause of justice forward. Now, I think that Jesuit law schools are different in subtle and important ways. I don't want to say that everything I have done is because of my exposure to the law schools, and that would be an insult to my mother and father and to all of the other people who had had an influence on me. But I think it is clear that a Jesuit education, a Jesuit legal education, has a profound impact. while the schools were originally founded for a religious purpose, they have all developed sociologically into something else. And here are some of the things that I think set the schools apart. First, at a time when cynicism was celebrated, Santa Clara did not indulge in that cynicism. And I think that that is a key element for success in forging justice. You cannot indulge in cynicism and allow yourself to be diverted. You have to be an idealist. And actually, Santa Clara Law School, when I was here, graduated in an entire class of idealists. And that is a fundamental element. Now, Santa Clara Law School trained us to compete in the legal world, but we were never taught that money was everything. And in fact, we had, or that winning was everything. In fact, I can recall so well discussions about, in the practice of law, not necessarily in a political environment, you're going to be dealing with the same set of lawyers over a period of time. And you should vigorously represent your client, but you should avoid gratuitous nastiness. You should avoid things that will haunt you and your co-workers in the community. And that is not what is taught in certain other law schools. Now, I can't really say how that was conveyed to me. I just know that the ambience it was. And not just in the classroom, but in other ways. I was mentioning to Cynthia, I was in law school here, and some of my Stanford classmates were in law schools, other law schools at the same time, and occasionally we would compare notes. And I was in the legal research and writing class. Now, that is a course where you learn how to do research, legal research in the library, and you have a topic, and you find the cases, and you prepare a document. And we had it was by alphabet, but we were thrown in to become a team to solve this issue. And we did actually care about each other and assist each other, because it wasn't to win the case, it was to learn. At the same time, I called my former roommate, Iathan Anand, who was at Hastings Law School, and she told me they were razor blading out the cases so that their competing students couldn't find the research. That is a very profound difference in approach to how we work, how we learn, and how we care about each other. So I do think that Santa Clara Law School, and likely the other Jesuit legal institutions, have a distinctive spirit where the values that brought us here matter, where the attitude of how you approach a set of facts and law does matter, where the styles of how you perform also matter, and what you aspire to accomplish is subtly influenced by the need to have a moral and ethical dimension to the law and to the practice of law. Now, these trends really inevitably intrude into the development of public policy in every dimension, and not just the practice of law. And I think the core of Santa Clara University are just a few things. First, the dignity of each individual, which is core. If you do not believe that each individual has inherent dignity worthy of respect, you cannot proceed on to a commitment to justice, because the commitment to justice is grounded on the belief that each person has inherent dignity. And then further, the emphasis on serving the poor and the disadvantaged. That doesn't mean that people with money are wrong, but it is the poor and disadvantaged who most need our assistance. And certainly the education we received here emphasized that we should be person-centered and that we should make sure that those most in need did not escape our attention. The other thing that was, this is taught to us, but it was also experienced by us as students. When I was here as a law student, there was never a time when I felt that I was not known as a person. I was not a cipher. And we were also in some way encouraged to stand up for each other. I remember well one of my fellow students, I won't mention his name, but he came from an extremely disadvantaged family. His mother was a maid in a welfare hotel in New York City. His brother was a heroin addict and in prison. He was the only one in his family who had ever managed to go to college, and he ended up at the University of Santa Clara Law School. He was a wonderful person, but really I think psychologically it was almost a step too far. He was having a hard time justifying his success with the struggles that his family were meeting, and he did not succeed academically, but not because he lacked the capacity. He was having trouble. And I remember it just never occurred to me not to go directly to the dean of the law school and insist that they readmit this young man and give him a chance and provide him extra assistance. Nobody nominated us, but we just felt that we were invited to do that. And I think it is that kind of encouragement, really, to assume that it is your responsibility to take action without being designated, that helps people, I think has helped me, to just step forward when I see an issue that I think needs a resolution and to play the role that I can. Now, I think that, as I mentioned, the education here at Santa Clara Law School is not confined to the classroom. The whole school is sensitive to the needs of the individual, and that justice is not confined just to a set of procedures or a set of formalities. It really goes to the core of respecting human dignity. And it's part of centering social justice on the inherent dignity of each person. Now, how to translate that into public policy? I have worked on many, many things, both as a lawyer and in local government and in the House of Representatives, but I have found myself spending an enormous amount of time on the issue of immigration reform in the House of Representatives. I once, as was mentioned in the introduction, I once practiced immigration law, and I also taught for a while immigration law here at the university. And when I was elected to Congress in 1994, I had expected, honestly, the Democrats had been, I am a Democrat, had been in the majority for 40 years, and I just assumed that would continue. And I still remember election night, and my friends and family were cheering, and I saw Newt Gingrich, and I thought this may not be as much fun as I had expected. So I went back to become the least powerful person possible in the House of Representatives, freshman member of the minority party. And I was just assigned to the Judiciary Committee. Nobody asked me what I wanted to do. And I realized that immigration reform was, in some ways, a controversial subject. There are people in my district who have very divergent views on it. And I'm ashamed to admit, the first Congress I was there, I didn't ask to be on the immigration subcommittee. I thought, well, do I need to do this? I mean, there are plenty of other people who are also well-schooled in this, but as time went on, I realized, especially because of the 96 Reform Act, that I needed to play a role in the formulation of this policy. In 1996, the then chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Henry Hyde, basically delegated to Congressman Lamar Smith, who was chair of the Immigration Subcommittee, if memory serves me correct, really the rewrite of key elements of immigration law that eliminated due process protections for aspiring immigrants, that attempted to criminalize mere presence in the United States. And I remember being on the floor thinking, you cannot say, because you are living and breathing the air in America, that you're a felon. That cannot possibly be the American law, just by existing. And so we went through a tremendous fight on that, obviously, because it was a party line vote. We lost many of the fights. Instituted at that time was a provision, I think one of the worst things that we've ever done in immigration law, which imposed something called the 3- and 10-year bar. It was basically, it was aimed at people from Latin America. and it basically said this: if you entered the United States without inspection, which is primarily people who cross a land border, and you otherwise later become eligible for an immigration benefit, and the most common way is you marry an American citizen. You cannot get that permanent residence visa unless you leave the United States for 10 years. At the time, I remember saying this. They said, this is going to cure illegal immigration. I said, no, this is going to destroy families, or this will force people into an underground situation. And sure enough, how unsatisfactory are the words, I told you so. We probably have, the estimates from the Migration Policy Institute are between 3 and 4 million people who are here undocumented but married to American citizens. And when I talk to some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it is their view that the Americans ought to leave the country. So I don't think that is a view that is commonly held in the United States. In fact, most people are not aware of the 3 and 10-year bar issue. But that was one of the things we fought, along with suspension of deportation. It used to be that if you were here for a very long time and you were good moral character and you had developed ties to the United States and you were in immigration court, you could seek discretionary relief and be granted permission to stay. Those matters were changed, along with summary deportation procedures that just completely eliminated due process for people who might have claims to asylum and the like. So that was my introduction to the need to step up to the bat on the issue of immigration reform. And it has not been a successful effort yet, but for the 4 years that the Congress had a Democratic majority, I chaired the Immigration Subcommittee while the Senate struggled to put together a comprehensive immigration reform bill. We did pass a bill to grant status to the DREAM Act students when the Democrats were in the majority. And the DREAM Act students are, if you don't know, this situation where a young person is brought to the United States and everybody knows that child didn't have a decision to make. I mean, they were brought because they were a little kid. And they've grown up as a de facto American, but there is no way to get from their status to legal status. It's one of the odd things in American law. Take the criminal law, for example. If you go in and steal a car, you're going to get caught, you're going to get arrested, you'll go to trial, or you may take a plea, you'll pay a fine, you might have some other sanction, but at the end of that process, you're good to go. You've done your debt, you're good, you've made your peace with the law, and you can go on and make a better life. In immigration, there's no way to get right with the law. It is a permanent problem. So many of these children, and this is another element I think that I learned from Santa Clara Law School, if you are going to give dignity to the individual, you actually have to meet with those individuals. You have to see them personally, hear their story. So it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's a visceral understanding of your obligation to help bring justice to a group. And I have met so many young people who a young man brought to the United States as a toddler, raised by his grandfather. He was the captain of the football team. He was the valedictorian of the high school. He believed he was an American citizen until he went down to get his student loans for college and discovered, much to his chagrin, that he had been born in another country. He was not an American, and there was no way for him to get from that status to a legal status. Replicate that to millions of young people, in variations of the theme, from never even knowing that you were not an American citizen, to finding out when you were 10 that you were not, to finding out when you were 16, when you went to get your driver's license. And this is a group of people who are innocent. They made no decision. And it is important for us to understand the agony that they face, the lack of choices. I mean, young people who, some of my colleagues say they should simply go home. To what? To a place that their home is here, to a place that they've never been, as a sentient adult, to speak a language that they do not speak. So that is a major effort that we have to make sure that those undocumented individuals have safe haven. When I chaired the committee, part of what I thought was important was to outline the issues for the American public. And I hear a lot of things from good Americans who have a belief but do not have some facts. One of the things I often hear is, I'm not against these immigrants, but they ought to do it the right way. And I had a hearing on farm workers. Now, I have a special spot in my heart for the farm workers. And as a matter of fact, I was told by the Farm Workers Union I was invited to go out and pick strawberries with the farm workers, and I did that. I was invited to go out and husk the corn, and I did that. And they told me I was the only member of Congress who accepted their invitation to go pick the crops with the farm workers. This is a hard job. And honestly, it's not a job that most Americans are lining up to do. And so when I have my salad, I think, who do I owe this salad to? Yeah, I bought the salad, but who put those greens on the plate? Who made sure I got that tomato? And it's some hard-working farm worker who quite often is being mistreated because they have no legal status. Well, we have about 2 million farm workers in the United States. The estimate is 80% of them are here without their documentation. And the truth is, there was no way for them to legally enter the United States. I invited Dr. Richard Land, who was then the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, to be a witness when I was chairman of the committee. Now, the Catholics are awesome when it comes to immigration. We have bishops there all the time, but the Baptists were kind of slow to the table in terms of talking about immigration. When they got there, though, they were fully there. And Dr. Land gave this testimony. He said, for many years, we had 2 signs at the southern border. One sign said, help wanted, and the other sign said, no trespassing. And we didn't do much border enforcement because the fact was we needed these individuals to come over to the United States and to help in the agricultural economy. Now that we have hardened the border so it is really very tough to get over the border, we basically stranded the farm workers here in the United States, and they are still in undocumented status. The other thing that we wanted to do was to make sure that people understood that if someone comes to the United States and commits a horrible crime, nobody's very sympathetic about that person staying here, in all honesty. Not immigrant communities and not a broader community. But the percentage of criminality among immigrants is actually substantially lower than the percentage of criminality among Americans. And why is that? People are so afraid not to make a misstep because they will be caught and be ripped from the arms of their family, a much more severe penalty than for the jaywalking or tail light out in the car, that people are super cautious not to commit an offense. The other thing that I have worked on as a member of the House is the condition of refugees. We have something called, there are many caucuses. I mean, there's, the light bulb caucus, and there's a million caucuses, and most of them never meet. You just put your name on it, gets printed. But the refugee caucus actually works together. It's a bipartisan group. I'm one of the co-founders and co-chairs of the refugee caucus. And here is my belief that obviously the United States cannot accept every refugee in the world, but we have a role as the country that's supposed to lead the cause of freedom, to have a beacon of light for those who are very oppressed and struggling. And so we admit around 70 or 80,000 refugees a year. Every year, I personally meet with the Secretary of State, along with the 3 other members of the Judiciary Committee, House and Senate, to establish the priorities for the refugees, to make sure that families are being respected, that the UN is doing what they need to do, that we are providing the resources once refugees are admitted. Now, I mention all of these things not because I am such a wonderful person, but because all of the things I've mentioned are under attack by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. In fact, just in the fall, on the funding for the House Homeland Security Committee, we had a series of amendments. The first amendment that passed on a party line vote would have deported all the DREAM Act kids that were given temporary relief by the president a couple of years ago. The second amendment that passed would have made sure that the parents of those children that the president is trying to assist through temporary relief would also be deported. Also, that we would eliminate due process rights for individuals seeking asylum here in the United States, and finally, that we would make sure that unaccompanied minor children, and I'll talk about that in a minute, who end up in the United States have no due process rights and are summarily returned to wherever they're from. Now, last spring, almost a year ago now, we started seeing a spike in the number of unaccompanied minor children coming to the United States. Why was that happening? We don't know for sure. But the interesting thing is these were children from basically three countries: Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We saw a spike of children coming to the United States, but also a spike of children escaping to Mexico and to Nicaragua and to Belize. So this was, obviously the U.S. is a first world country. It might be the destination of choice for many, but these were young people fleeing for their lives from these countries. I went down to Brownsville to personally take a look at what the situation was. And it was something that haunts me to this day, because what I found were hundreds of children being held in Border Patrol jails. And there were cement cells with one toilet with no privacy, and little kids just sleeping on the cement. The Border Patrol agents were overwhelmed. I think they were doing the best they could. They were going out and buying burritos to feed these children. But in talking, they were locked in these cells. And two vignettes. The first, a grandmother who had three little girls with her. And she mentioned that her daughter, the mother of the grandchildren, lived in Chicago and had been sending money until the gangs came and wanted more money. And her daughter scrambled, got donations from other relatives and neighbors, and borrowed money from her boss. They sent that money to the gang. They came back and said they were going to take these little girls and make use of them. And so the grandmother did what I thought was admirable. She took those children and she escaped, and she saved them from being used by these gang members. As we talked, I realized these children might well have a claim for asylum. The grandmother would probably be returned. And she actually understood that, and she was willing to do that to save the lives of these little children. The other memory that is so strong is all of these little children, basically age 8, 9, and 10, 11, holding younger children. And there was a little toddler, couldn't speak really. The only thing she kept saying over and over again was Miami. No one knew who she was, and she was being cared for by older girls, 11, 12-year-old girls, passing her around. And I thought, going back to the need to attend to the human dignity of each person, we failed at that moment, although we have gotten our act together at this point in terms of appropriately taking care of children. But the individuals involved did not fail. That grandmother did not fail to stand up and to protect those little girls. And those 10 and 11-year-old little girls did not fail that toddler. And so it was an inspiration to me to go back and actually speak quite vigorously to the Secretary Health and Human Services and the Secretary of Homeland Security and the White House to marshal the resources that we could to make sure that those children got what they needed. Now, the final thing I'll talk about, and then we can get into our panel discussion. I look forward to many questions or advice. I can always use advice. Is the need for reform of the system and where we are now. I know many of you know that the Senate actually put together an immigration reform bill in the last Congress, and it was tough for them to do, but they did get a very strong vote, and then it was the House's turn. At the same time the senators were working, I was doing something on the House side, and I think really very much was influenced on my experience here at the Jesuit Law School. How do we come together, people who are very divergent in their views, how do you get together for a reform effort? And we put together a bipartisan group. We never called ourselves a gang, but a bipartisan group. And we met sometimes 2 and 3 times a week. We met in secret for 4 years. We had hundreds of hours of meetings into this. And here was the premise. Let's define what the issues are. And that's why it took so long. I had the legal staff. What are the facts? So I didn't want anybody to agree to anything unless they really understood what they were agreeing to. What were the political implications? What were the numbers? What's the history of the law? What changes could be made? And we worked our way through issue by issue. And, the divide in Washington between the parties is very severe. One of the Republican members told me about 2 years into this process that if you had asked him before we began, he would have said he didn't know any Democrats. But now he considered he had friends who were Democrats. And these are very conservative men. I mean, we didn't agree on many, many things, but that we could deal with each other in a way that was respectful, because the human dignity is not just the people who need your help. It's about the people you're working with. And the fact that you don't agree with them is not an excuse to treat individuals in a dismissive way. You need to work through these issues. And so after 4 years, we actually came to an agreement. It wasn't the thing I would have wanted first place, but it was a compromise and it was workable. And we actually put the bill into bill language, at which point the Republican leadership really pulled the plug on the entire effort, and the Republican members had to walk away from it. I do not criticize them for that. They did what was necessary given the circumstances. But we do have that compromise measure still out there, not introduced, but knowing that we could get to where we needed to go. On the Senate bill, the way the House is organized, and you look at the Constitution, you'll never find a mention of a political party. But the majority really has tremendous say in the House. The chairman of every committee is a member of the majority party. The speaker is a member of the majority party, and no bill and no amendment is permitted unless the majority party permits it. So it is, an incredible set of power, and the speaker would not allow the Senate bill to have a vote. Now, many of us, on a bipartisan basis, were working to see, could we pass it? And we actually did a count, and we knew that we had the votes when we did the count. We could have passed it if he had simply put the measure up for a vote, but we could not convince him to do so. So finally, we decided that we should focus, we being the proponents, not the Republican proponents, they, for political reasons, could never do that, but to focus on asking the president to do what he could lawfully do under existing immigration law to bring some relief. Not that it's a substitute for comprehensive immigration reform, because the president can't create the law. He can only, use what exists in the law. So there is something called deferred action. It's been used frequently in different contexts since Eisenhower was president. In some cases for foreign policy reasons, in some cases for domestic policy reasons. And we, I probably have 100 pages, thank you, Santa Clara Law School, of memos into the department with points and authorities and case law outlining why the president had the authority to take categories of individuals who were of particular concern and allow them on a case-by-case basis to apply for deferred action. There is a statute in the current immigration law that allows people who are in a deferred action category to receive work authorization. The Congress delegated that authority in the statute to the executive branch. And so we urged first that he didn't do everything I asked, but that we expand the DREAM Act issue, so because it was so restrictive when first devised, so that people who are brought here as children, but they're now over 30, should still be able to apply. And the value of that is, if you were brought here when you were 2 years old and you're now 30 years old, what sense is it to think you should go someplace you've never been? You're here. This is your home. To expand the deferred action to the parents of U.S. citizens. Now, why would that make sense? Many of the undocumented individuals in the country are what you call mixed families. And what we've seen is immigration enforcement that basically takes the parents away from minor children. We have hundreds of thousands of American citizens who have one or in some cases, both parents who've been removed. We have thousands of American citizen kids who've ended up in foster care because their parents have been removed. In some cases, and we're putting a stop to this, courts have terminated parental rights because a parent was deported and put children up for adoption, which is surely one of the most chilling things I have heard of. So we suggested that that might be an interesting element for deferred action. We did a further suggestion that has not yet been adopted, but that we hope will be, which is to do something for the farm workers. Maybe it's when I was getting the strawberries picked with the farm workers over in Davenport, I think about them often. And the fact that they really have very little ability to integrate into broader life because of the rural community setting that they so often are in. And that there's something called parole authority, and that we would ask the president to use that authority to give them temporary relief. I'll stop now, but I will just say that our fight for justice in immigration is far from over. I hope that all of you, will find a way to do what you can to help us. We need to have a comprehensive effort across the United States for people of goodwill to step up to the bat for those who need our help so much. Thank you very much.
So thank you very, very much, Zoe. I am joined up here by two professors, Professor Cynthia Mertens from the School of Law and Professor Elsa Chen from the Political Science Department. And we thought we'd start just by allowing the two of you, in whatever order you wish, to respond to the remarks by Zoe.
I'll start. Welcome, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. I want to thank the people who have put on this leadership symposium. I am very impressed with what I've seen and heard. Mick McCarthy's been, of course, very instrumental. Susan Chung, Nancy Diaz, all of you have just put on a tremendous job. I'd also like to say that I'm very, very grateful for Zoe. I'm grateful for her words, for her wisdom, her dedication, her generosity. This woman works more hours than you can imagine. Her inspiration and her leadership. She has been truly a model of what Santa Clara University produces. And I'm very, very pleased to have her here and to be able to listen to her words. Now, I have many thoughts about what she said, and I'll just throw out a couple of them because they actually were thoughts that I've had over quite a period of time. The idea that our dreamers, the youngsters who were brought here as children, should have a place in our society is so compelling. And I invite any of you who would like to meet and talk to one of these young people to contact me. Because as Zoe said in her remarks, once you speak with them, once you see what contributions they can make, what they have done to get to where they are, and I'm talking about Santa Clara University students who I know, it is an amazing, amazing story that will bring you to tears, I promise. That's an open invitation to you. Contact me if you'd like to speak to any of them. And I know that Zoe has spoken to hundreds of these young people, and she mentioned that in her talk, but there is nothing more compelling than actually sitting down and having a conversation. And then the second thing that I want to respond to, because again, Zoe brought it up, and I'm very involved in thinking about some of these issues, the immigration issue, the unaccompanied minors, the reason that they're coming here. And one of the compelling things, and many of you probably know this, that Santa Clara University does is it does take faculty, staff, and has a program in El Salvador for students where you can actually see what the conditions are and why people, and young people particularly, they're compelled, they're forced to leave because of the gangs. And I think that what this does to individuals who experience it, and I take law students to El Salvador, is it opens their hearts and their minds and teaches them, shows them that they need to walk in solidarity. We need to help change conditions. We can't impose, our ideas are not the ones that are going to work, but we need to work with the people in those countries to help improve their conditions. So although I have hours of conversation, I will turn it over to Elsa.
I'd like to echo Cynthia's thank yous to all the people. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. I'd like to echo Cynthia's thank yous to all the people who put this together, and especially to Congresswoman Lofgren, whom I'm so proud to call a Santa Clara alum, but also proud to call my representative in Congress. And it's so inspiring to come together on a weekend morning and meet somebody who's such an epitome of the application of Jesuit values to political leadership, especially in a time right now of such partisan rancor, inability to get along and cooperate. It's just amazing to meet somebody who really feels committed to teamwork and cooperation and genuine respect for people even across the aisle. That's something that's very important, and I think that's something that we need to lead our country out of a situation where we're, stagnating and things are ugly. I love the focus on morality and ethics and recognition of the dignity of each individual, and especially of those individuals who are most voiceless, most powerless, most disadvantaged in our society. This is particularly important in a time when inequality is so great and its consequences lead to such enormous suffering. I was really inspired hearing you talk about feeling the responsibility to take action even when you're not designated. And that means you're not designated by being in a position of leadership and authority, but you are designated. It's your human obligation. And I love the fact that you recognize that, especially when there are risks to doing so, risks to stepping up for those folks who are voiceless. The media are so quick to highlight every gaffe and distort, your words, but you're willing to go out there and take a lead anyway, and that's leadership. I was thinking about your words and connecting them to a talk that I recently attended by Brian Stevenson, who's the director of the Equal Justice Institute and the author of a book called Just Mercy. And he had also talked about the importance of proximity, physical and emotional closeness And I'm so glad that some of our politicians are willing to go and meet with the individuals affected by the law, like undocumented youth, like dreamers and farmers. You know, it's very important to get up close and personal, and that's something that the Ignatian Center really advances here at Santa Clara, proximity. And if we have a chance later, we can talk about how we use that in our teaching. I also don't want to just say, hey, we all need to feel sorry for people, but you know, we have to understand facts, and we have to be willing to incorporate facts into the formation of our beliefs. Father Eng talked about how Ignatius did that, right? It was dedicated to trying to learn in order to, you know, make the world a better place. And that's a part of our job as educators, but also part of all of our job as citizens. And I think most of all, I was really inspired by your willingness to recognize and call out examples of institutional and political failure to respect the human dignity and rights of all people, including those folks at the border camps who are being punished again after enduring so much suffering. We need to use our power and our authority responsibly, but also compassionately. And we need to challenge power and authority when that needs to be done. And if you're not in a position of leadership, you can still be in a position to challenge the leadership to do better and to do right and to do good. And I think that's something that we're hearing from Congresswoman Lofgren that's so promising, despite the fact that people always feel kind of negative about politics these days. Just knowing there are leaders like you makes me feel really comforted.
Thank you, Elsa and Cynthia. Maybe I could ask Zoe you a question, because as you listen to the larger national political discourse, it's really clear that people are in such different places, right? I mean, it seems to be that especially on the issue of immigration, there are different universes, totally different principles. And I understand where you're coming from. You speak about the importance of human dignity as being really a driver of the legal system. When you listen to the other position, coming from a very different place, it's that how can, as a country, we valorize the breaking of law, right? That seems to be, in some respects, the principled objection to any kind of comprehensive immigration reform, at least as I understand it. How do you respond to that? Does the question make sense? I mean, there's a very different principle, and when I encounter people who raise that really in good faith, it's hard to know how these two worlds can come together, and an Ignatian leader, one hopes, can bring two worlds together. So could you just address that a little bit?
Sure, I'll try. There are some of my colleagues who objectify and they demonize immigrants, and it is very difficult to make progress with those individuals because they're not addressing reality. They are addressing their construct. But many people are not in that category, as you have mentioned. And I think what I think of is that actually we write the laws, and we have amended the immigration laws over the years many times. In fact, I mentioned in '96 we changed the law so people who prior to that could easily have complied with the law now find themselves unable to comply with the law. So I think we need to look at the nation's interests, and I'll take the farm workers as an example. We need to have farm workers. We do not have Americans stepping forward wanting to pick crops in the fields enough to meet our needs. We have people from other countries who see being a farm worker in America as a step forward for their family and want to do that job. We have currently in the law 5,000 visas a year for all unskilled work visas. And that would be, I mean, hotel workers, nannies, busboys, farm workers, 5,000 a year. Well, obviously the need of the economy is much larger than 5,000 a year. And going back to Dr. Land's testimony, the two signs, help wanted, no trespassing. We set this situation up, actually. And now I think we have an obligation, having set this situation up, to transition people who responded to a lawful status, setting criteria that meets the needs for justice. Perhaps, some people think there should be a fine, or there should be a probation period, or a process. Those are all things that we discussed and can deal with. And then to craft a law that actually will prevent this from happening in the future, that has a realistic assessment of the needs of American families and the American economy, and then enforce that. Mm-hmm. And I think when you go through those elements, there are certain other exceptions. For example, political asylum or refugee status, that's outside of that system, and I do think it's important that we maintain that as our role of beacon of hope in the world. But that's an existing law. Mm-hmm. So I think if we could make a workable legal system, we could all celebrate that, and we could also celebrate the enforcement of it.
Is that to suggest that progress in terms of immigration reform is going to be largely driven by economic principles rather than, say, principles of human dignity or social justice? Because what you just described is, hey, look, we need this.
I think it's both. I'll never forget a woman. I meet with people from all over the country because of my position on the Judiciary Committee. And this woman came in to visit me. She was about 60 years old, blonde hair, from Florida. And her first question to me was, explain why my grandchildren have to grow up in Mexico. Because of the 3- and 10-year bar. And so there's really no good explanation for that. She was really angry that she was cut off from her grandchildren. So reconciling the law, making it work for families, and for the economy, it's both. And they're not at odds with each other.
Great. We're going to turn to, we'll have Q&A, and there's a microphone going around, so you can raise your hand. But before we get to those, you can start thinking about your questions. I want to offer Cynthia and Elsa a chance to respond to anything, including the question, how do you yourself, as professors at a place like Santa Clara, consider either yourself an Ignatian leader or trying to develop your students as leaders in this particular tradition?
We have the privileged, I think, position as educators to be constantly in front of young people who, whether they consciously are aware of it or subconsciously are aware of it, are influenced by our words and our actions. So I think educators have a particular responsibility to convey to their students through words, but primarily through action, what we need to do in this world. So I consider my job, and I'll tell you how I do it in a minute, to light a fire under those young people and get them motivated to do something. Even if they go into the big law firms, they take the message with them that they have a duty to do something in those firms that is going to make the world a better place. What I do when I was struggling with what I think many of us struggle with, which is what can I do individually that will make a difference? And it's sometimes difficult to find that. And I decided in the year 2000, when I went on a faculty staff immersion trip to El Salvador, that I would make that opportunity available to law students, but I had no idea how to do that. It took me 4 years to finally get a plan in action, and I did take and have taken now 5 or 6 groups of law students to El Salvador with the sole idea of not just opening their hearts and opening their minds so that when they go out into practicing law here in the U.S., they have some perception of how most of the world lives, some idea that they need to do something. They have to accept the challenge and do something. And I think that most of the students who have taken that opportunity through the law school, and then of course we do it through the undergraduate school and in many ways, come out changed individuals, and their hearts and souls are on fire. And the other aspect that I personally am involved in is our civil legal clinic is called the George and Catherine Alexander Community Law Center. And one of our primary focuses is immigration. And we're dealing with a lot of human trafficking victims right now and unaccompanied minors. So again, somebody needed to be the director of the Law Center. And when I was asked to accept that challenge, I decided that I needed to do that. It's something I had done in the past, but it gives me the opportunity to, again, see the daily struggles of so many people. We also do consumer and workers' rights, and I don't know how many of you saw that wage claim, wage theft production on, I believe it was NBC. But anyway, we were very involved in that.
I don't feel like I'm always in a position of great power and authority, but I do feel that I have the privilege, like Cynthia said, to be in a position to lead, whether it's by example or in the classroom or with my family or in the community. And whatever position that we have in which we can lead others, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that we should do so with those 3 C's: competence, conscience, and compassion. And so the way that I approach this in the classroom is to try to promote this notion of proximity. In my housing and homelessness policy class, I use the Arupe Center, which is part of the Ignatian Center at Santa Clara University, because I feel like it's important for students to really understand firsthand the problems that we have in our society, right? So week after week, they go and sit side by side besides individuals who are experiencing homelessness and struggling with drug addiction, recovering from abuse. And that kind of experience is really humbling and motivating and inspiring for the students in a way that's very different than just being told by me in the classroom, with a PowerPoint presentation, hey, homeless is a big problem. We don't have affordable housing. You need to help make that change. Same thing with my criminal justice policy class, right? I try not to emphasize, hey, this is the law, and so we have to follow the law, and if you break the law, that's bad. But instead, try to focus on the justice aspect of criminal justice and help the students get uncomfortable, right? Take them out of their comfort zone so that they really begin to question their beliefs and their assumptions. And so in the criminal justice policy class, the students are all required to do ride-alongs with the police in the summer because it's important to see, okay, what do police officers do and what kind of decisions do they make, right? I take them to San Quentin Prison and the county jail and the mental health drug court or the reentry center for prisoners. All of these things are intended to be unsettling, maybe scary, maybe uncomfortable. But I know that they're eye-opening and transformative and unforgettable, and maybe someday when they are in a congressional office as a staffer or as a member of Congress or as the President of the United States, that's going to stick with them. That's the thing about the Jesuit education, right? We're not there to tell them, hey, this is how income inequality works, go out there and change it. We want them to sort of come to that place themselves, sort of the way Ignatius did, right? And I feel that that's something that we offer at Santa Clara that I can help people, gain. And that would be sort of my biggest contribution as a leader in the classroom.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to open it to questions and answers from the audience. So if you have a question, just please simply raise your hand.
Hi. I'm wondering, Zoe, do you think that immigration reform has to be comprehensive in order to be just? If you could strike an accord that would reform, for example, the broken business immigration system, but would leave out the possibility of a legal pathway to citizenship for undocumented people, would you do that?
Well, it depends on the details. We told the Republicans that we were open to doing pairing things. But I do think that I would be troubled if the only people to benefit were elites. I think you could do a business immigration something that dealt with, the technology industry, but also farm workers, and you would have something you could defend as justice. But the concern really has been, even though we're willing to work, see if we could come up to an agreement such as that, as a political matter, you end up running into parts of the economy or interest groups that say, well, what about me, and make it harder to do. If you say, okay, we're going to do something, and at one point we had a bipartisan bill to do something just about the farm workers, because they are a discrete group of people who are particularly, I think, abused oftentimes. And, we move forward on that, but then people in the restaurant business and the hotel industry said, well, what about us? And then, so it becomes, as a political matter, almost very difficult. It's much easier to think about than it is to actually accomplish. But we've made it clear that if you want to have, a series of bills or pair people, different groups together, we're game to look at that. But the problem is that, at least so far, the Republican leadership, when push comes to shove, don't want to do anything. They are divided among themselves. And there are certainly Republican House members who would like to do a reform effort, and I've talked to them all the time. There are Republican House members who would like to do it privately, but publicly they've never let anyone know because there's some high political risk to that position. And then there are some who they're part of the no caucus, on anything. There was a bill put together, it was passed unanimously out of the Homeland Security Committee, which I'm actually, contrary to the introduction, I'm no longer on the Homeland Security Committee. I moved back to the Science Committee. But, a unanimous vote is, very difficult to get. The Republicans were going to put it up for a vote, and then they found they couldn't do it. They couldn't even put a bill that was unanimous out of a contentious committee. So I regret that there seems to be an inability at this point to do anything.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
This question of political risk, because I think we're all quite aware that that's one of the real big issues, right? And one would hope that leadership, I'm talking leadership, right. Leadership recognizes that there are larger principles, larger goods for which one should advocate, even if it includes political risk. At least that might be my very idealistic understanding of leadership. Now, I'm also not in a political office. Right. So can I ask you to weigh in on that question? And particularly, if you want to, talk about how you have encountered the issue of political risk in your own career.
Well, one of the things I learned long ago is you can't make everybody happy.
Right.
And people say you need to represent your constituency. That is absolutely true. But I have nearly, 700,000 people who I represent, and they don't always agree with each other. So you need to figure out what you think, listening to every voice and every position, what you think is the best course forward. That's ethical, that serves the interests of your country and your constituents, that is fair-minded. And in the end, that's all you can do. And if someone wants to run against you and defeat you, then, I hope I've done a good job, but if I were defeated over a principled vote, it would not ruin my life. Because I have a life, I have a family, I have a community. There are things that are important to do. Now, not every vote you take is of that stature. Whether you have, $10 allocated to this or $10.50 allocated to this, that's usually not a conscious vote, but there are some votes and some stands that are like that. I cannot speak for those who, I try to understand them, I try to deal with their issues, I try to forge compromises, but I cannot speak for those who are afraid to act.
I wanted to jump in with a question also that you reminded me of. You were speaking about your colleagues across the aisle who are unwilling to do things sometimes. And, the country is so divided. There are so many people who really, really disagree with everything you said this
Yeah,
morning.
I know.
And so I'm trying to figure out why. I mean, I don't think it's satisfactory to think, oh, people are just morally depraved and they have no values and they're just all out for a buck and all they care about is the elites. I feel like if we just demonize, people who don't agree with you or us, that doesn't work, right? So what do you think it is? Is it the lack of compassion? Is it a lack of proximity that leads to sort of no empathy? Is it just a different set of values that are, equally important but just completely inconsistent with the values that you have? What is it? Because if we don't understand, I don't see how we're going to make any progress.
Well, I have, unless proven otherwise, my assumption always is that the people who agree with me are not immoral. They're just seeing a different set of things than I'm seeing. And so how do we find common ground? How do we understand each other and move forward in the good of the country? It is important to understand the country's very diverse. I remember years ago, I was talking to a member of Congress from the South. And I said, my district is very diverse. I mean, there is no ethnic majority in the county that I live in. And he said, with kind of a sparkle in his eyes, well, we have diversity too. We've got Baptists and Methodists in the same town. So it's, what people see as their world is different. And I do think you need to be careful. I want always try and be careful. I don't want to sound dismissive. But if you are living in a world that is monochromatic and all of a sudden there are a few people from a different culture, and it can be very alarming. And I think that some of that is happening around the country. Now, the forces in the other direction, it's been interesting to grow our coalition for immigration reform, because we, part of getting something done is, the art of the possible. My job is to, how can I help you help me, right? So we've got the entire panoply of the religious community. I mean, the Catholics, the Southern Baptists, the conservative evangelicals, the liberal evangelicals, Jewish faith, the Hindu, everybody. And the evangelicals had a plan, and they followed through on it, to make the sermons every Sunday for several months only about immigration reform, in the hopes that it would open hearts and minds across the country. It didn't apparently work. We've got a business group that's organized, and the law enforcement group. So I don't really know, and I've thought so much about this, all of the issues that people are dealing with. In some cases, it is about race. I mean, not in every case, but in some cases it's anxiety about diversity. And that's something that is a long problem in American history that we have yet to solve.
Good. We have a couple questions. Mike will find them.
Thanks. So Zoe, I hear you pointing to two words that come to my mind: understanding and ignorance. Because I think about your journey into the strawberry fields, your journey, into Texas to meet with the grandmother and the three children. And it's that kind of an experience that creates understanding and takes away ignorance when we're with people in that way. So my question is, how much do you see misunderstanding or ignorance at the root of some of the divide when people in fact share common values? And behind a lot of the anxiety when we get into things like race and fear around it?
Well, we all get to choose what we're exposed to. And I'll just go back to my trip down to Brownsville. We were there for several days. We visited a lot of facilities. We went to the border. And so we decided, myself and Congressman Joe Garcia and the chief counsel from the subcommittee was there, that we should go to these holding cells and see the children and understand what they were going through. At the same time that we were doing that, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and Congressman Elsa went back to the border and took boat rides on the Rio Grande and helped capture a pregnant lady. That's what they did at the same time frame. So I think my experience was more enlightening than capturing a pregnant lady, but they were very celebratory about that experience. So I can't tell my colleagues what to do. They are employed by their voters, and so I really think the dialogue almost needs to be among Americans, and then the direction needs to be given to their employees, the members of the House and Senate.
We have a question. It's the guy in the Giants cap. The guy in the Giants cap gets priority here. Right behind you, Mike. Right behind you.
I think that's a little Giants bias there.
It is.
Okay, good. So, Congresswoman, a lot of our discussion is focused around compromise and ignorance. And I would argue that democracy is kind of based upon the ability to come to ideas together as a nation. That being said, how do you kind of, let's just look at stats right now. 2014 voter turnout was pathetic. It was something like 30%.
Correct.
So how do we increase voter turnout? Because I think that is the key to achieving compromise, both amongst people themselves in public and then in the Congress. So how do we increase voter turnout that way?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the turnout nationwide, about a quarter of eligible voters voted. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how to encourage participation from people who historically have not participated. And just looking at California, for example, there are congressional seats where the incumbent member of Congress voted to deport all the DREAM Act kids and to strip due process and the like that have 50% of their population ethnic minorities. How can that be? So I really think it's not the fault of those, it's my fault. And what I'm thinking about is how can we engage in a campaign, not a political campaign, of helping people understand how to do it. I was talking to the Secretary of State. I was in Sacramento last week, and he's got some ideas on how to make information more available to people. But not everyone who has yet voted knows how to do it. I mean, the simple mechanics are own, and people have some pride. They don't want to embarrass themselves in front of their neighbors. I mean, one of the frequently asked questions is, if you go to vote, do you have to vote on every race? You may not know about all the races. People don't know the answer to that. It's not a test. You get to vote for who you want. How do you register? Where do you go? So it's just the simple mechanics. And then I think the other thing, I would rather have a comprehensive immigration reform bill done. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to do that. So they have set for the country what the stakes are. And I think we need to make clear what those stakes are, and then people can make their own choice for their own future.
Congresswoman Lofgren, this is a question regarding the unaccompanied minors that came in with the big surge in 2014. I understand it was in the 50,000 range.
Right.
And you mentioned these holding areas, like a prison in a way, that these young children will remain there until they get legal representation. And I also understand the immigration law is only a second most complex law, with IRS, tax law being the most, of course. So how can we resolve this issue with these unaccompanied minors needing legal representation?
Well, that's a very good question. First, there was an Unaccompanied Minor Child Act that was actually my bill, and in order to get it passed, we put a Republican member's name on the bill. But when all of this happened, my former colleague, Howard Berman, said, are you getting a lot of flack because this was all your bill? And but maybe they don't know since we had to take your name off of it. I said, no, it's fine. I'm happy with what we did to provide some standards, and the standards provide that a child who's unaccompanied needs to be removed from the custody of the Border Patrol and put into a more appropriate home-like setting within 72 hours, and the Department of Health and Human Services is in charge of providing those facilities. What happened last year was that the surge was so immense that, and for a lot of reasons, Health and Human Services didn't have any place to put these kids, and so we went all over the country to try and find temporary facilities until they could be placed waiting for their hearing. I do think that having little kids traverse Mexico by themselves is not an optimal situation. And those kids have suffered, many of them, abuse of really horrendous sorts on that journey. I suggested three things to the administration as that was happening. First, we should send personnel down to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to process cases of children who are afraid for their lives right there, and so that they don't have to take that dangerous journey, and that those who meet standards can be admitted in an orderly fashion. Number two, we are not without some connection to the disorder that is happening in Central America. If you take a look, the Honduras is, from all accounts, the worst right now. I mean, it's completely melting down. And I think there are a lot of reasons for it, but the U.S. played a hand in the coup that disrupted the democratically elected government in Honduras in 2009 that was trying to put a different path forward for Honduras that would be more democratic, that would eliminate or try to eliminate the wealth and opportunity gap in that country, and the CIA played a role in disrupting that. So I think once you break it, you own it. We have a role to play here in bringing some stability to that region while we adhere to our values and our law of allowing legitimate asylum cases to be heard. Now, it is not the case. We could not get the votes to provide a counsel for children. But you can imagine, here you are, you're 10, you speak Spanish, not English, you're in court by yourself. How can you possibly explain yourself? You can't. So we have, the administration put some actual funding to go out and recruit lawyers. Lawyers are being trained, and I will say that lawyers all over the country have stepped forward to help. I'm really quite proud that people have stepped forward to help. It's a complex area of the law. You're right. It was the Supreme Court that said only tax law was more complex than immigration law. But it is possible to learn the law of asylum if you're a lawyer. And, for example, my daughter she's in-house in a Silicon Valley company, and they had their annual all-hands meeting, and all of the lawyers were asked to think about volunteering, which she is going to do, to help with the representation of these unaccompanied minor children. So I think certainly the law clinic and the USF dean has actually taken the lead in Northern California on the training. I think that's important, but it's a very complicated area.
I gave my word that Congresswoman Lofgren could be walking out of here at 10:30, and I'm not going to be another Jesuit liar. So let us thank Congresswoman Lofgren, Professors Chen and Mertens for this very stimulating time.